Let's begin.
Hey there, scary story fanatics. Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. I'm so glad you were able to return. Speaking of returns, it's time we get back to the story that begged for expansion. So, if you're in the mood to retrace your steps, lock your doors, be thankful that you're inside, and settle in for a little story that I like to call Return to Ambivalence Grove.
The passage of time unfolds events, provides life experiences, and moves on without hesitation. Like a predator crushing an anthill beneath its padded paws, and doesn't even break its stride, unaware of the secret goings-on beneath his feet, the chaos and disarray caused by a lack of perspective of all things, great and small. Storms come and go, volcanoes bury villages and their people, and yet the spin of the earth continues, unhinged at what we perceive as tragedy. But, such as with most formidable forces of nature, the lingering effects of experiences cause those with a conscious mind to remember these things that will go unwritten in the annals of time, forgotten to all but those who remember them, or have passed down their experiences to younger generations. The fate of Ambivalence Grove, its people, or even its existence, may have faded into hearsay and rumor, but the memories of my experiences, the fate of my girlfriend, Stephanie, will never leave me. Without answers, without closure, I am doomed to relive the hell of my past on regular nightly intervals. When I first moved here, it didn't take long to make friends, and Stephanie and I were hanging out within a month after my enrollment in the local high school. It was her who had filled me in on the local legend of a ghost town named Ambivalence Grove, unexplainably correlated to a nightly apparition known as the Midnight Man. The way to Ambivalence, marked with an obscure sign reading, "See you soon," set about 30 feet within a dense tree line, off the road, on the outskirts of town. The kids in the area claim that if you wait by that old sign at midnight, under the light of a blue moon, that the Midnight Man will appear and lead you through the woods, up the hill to Ambivalence, where one will find the town intact, its residents fearful and tortured, and a doomed fate awaiting all. Sneaking away from a party, Steph and I tempted said fate by following this odd ritual to the letter. That night, we saw the Shadow Man, dressed all in black, standing ominously motionless in the forest, and deciding it too dangerous to follow him, we watched him turn and disappear into the distance of the night. We fled, but we didn't escape. Something followed us, followed Steph. After a series of unsettling events, Stephanie wound up missing, and I was fingered as the #1 suspect in her disappearance, seeing as I was the last to contact her, or, with the exception of her parents, see her alive. The investigation was headed up by a man who was named and titled Detective Williamson. Williamson was convinced that I was the culprit he was looking for. I couldn't exactly tell him all the details, or he'd have me committed or worse. Still, there was absolutely no evidence that could link Stephanie's disappearance to me, and as the weeks progressed, I heard less and less of the police and their detectives. Even then, I assumed that things only appeared on the surface as quiet and passing me over. But still waters run deep, and I could almost sense the turbulence to come. Once things quieted down a bit, or at least seemed that way, I did make my way to Ambivalence. Not just once, but many times. 2 or 3 times most weeks. Of course, nearly all of these ventures occurred during daylight hours, but there was the occasional nightly trek as well. Those, however, didn't take place until towards the end, closer to the time in which I ended up where I am presently. But I'll get back to that. It started with one initial trip through the woods, past that old sign, and up that forested hill in the middle of the day. Although the thick overhead canopy blanketed most of the forest floor below in shadow, reminding me of that fateful moonlit night, the woods presented themselves as cheerful and placid, a stark contrast to its mood under the cover of night. Even as low-lit as it was beneath the sunlit sky, blockaded by treetops. That first day, I expected to experience some ominous feelings or unsettling wrench in my gut. But the woods insisted on tranquility, almost mocking me in my desperation, because I wanted to feel that awkward sensation. I wanted something to be lurking behind at least one of those trees. Stephanie was all I could think about. Entering those woods, I was unsure of my desires. Once deep within them, I knew what it was I sought with a solidity. I didn't care what happened to me. I needed to help Steph. I don't know why, but somehow I knew that she was still alive, somewhere, wherever she was. It was an intuition from deep within me that I just couldn't explain, but forced me to accept. As I sauntered past the trees and flora, I couldn't help but notice the abundance of wildlife. Birds of all different songs, fuzzy-tailed rodents scurrying about, nothing but dense forest, and a meadow-like path, complete with very tall grass, cut its way through the forest like an incision. It filled an area of a gap between large trees, a presence I realized to be the remnants of an old dirt road, nearly completely reclaimed by the surrounding timberland. I knew where it intended to lead me, and I followed it as far as it would take me, yonder up the mountainside. That was the day I caught my very first sight of the remnants of that old town, or what was left of it. There were many vestiges of old foundations, ruins of what used to be 2-story homes, broken down into nothing but a crumpled pile of rotten lumber and sod, nearly completely retaken by the forest. But I did not notice any of these things at first. In fact, if it wasn't the decrepit testimony of what used to be a church, the only thing left somewhat standing, I likely would have wandered right by it all, never noticing this archaic museum of what once was a thriving quarry town. I fought my way through the immense underbrush and gained entrance to the structure. The interior was nothing more than a hollow shell, sunlight creeping in through the seams of the exterior paneling, draping my surroundings in stripes of shaded light. I spent hours there, in the church, searching the foundations of old homes that I discovered once I recognized I was in the place to do so. I wanted to call out to her, shout out for him to come to me, but I knew that he wouldn't appear, and Steph would be unable to give any reply. Sad, defeated, and learning nothing of use, I left with the intention of doing some research, finding out when the next blue moon would occur. Between inquiry by my parents and my dad, frequently on the one and only computer we own during his free time, it wasn't until the landscape outside was dappled in starlight that I got the chance to make use of a very popular online search engine. Locating a lunar calendar and identifying the necessary date was no more challenging than typing a few characters into a search bar. I couldn't believe it. 2 months. I was expecting to have to wait much longer, but the calendar days combined with the lunar cycle facilitated an occasion that happens even much less often than the blue moon itself, 2 of them occurring in such a short span of time. Providence or coincidence, I didn't care. I knew what I had to do. I knew that I had to prepare. A loud whistling wind careened outside my window, nearly rattling the glass. The sky was blue all day, and the stars had been out all evening. There was no indication of a pending storm. I went to log out of the tower and stand, but before I could, every single light in the house went black. The computer turned off, and I could hear my folks upstairs clamoring for candles and my father's phone, which served as his backup alarm clock for work. The power had gone out. This was clear. What wasn't clear was if the entire street was out, or if it was just us. I proceeded to walk to the window, a large bay portal which allowed for perfect vision of the surrounding homes. But my sight never made it past my parents' front lawn. I saw him there, black as night, but plain as day. He was tall, very tall, but not inhumanly so. He was either made of shadow or entirely cloaked within it, presented as a solid black form, complete with his encircling brimmed hat. He stood there, completely motionless. Startled at first, yes, but not scared in the slightest. Quickly finding my resolve and bent on my own intentions. I would meet him, follow him, make him take me to her. But as soon as I went to turn for the door, the power was restored, the lights flickered on, and the soft, distant sound of the microwave powering up traversed the silent home. I instantly shot my focus back to the window, but he was gone. He was there a second beforehand, and now he seemingly vanished into thin air. The only residue of his presence were black stripes and swirls throughout the lawn where he stood, appearing purposeless. Even when I went outside to take a closer look, it proved far too dark outside to clearly discern any noticeable pattern. But I also conducted said scrutiny in a half-assed fashion. I was now on a mission and had a long bike ride ahead of me. I had no reservations about traveling out to that old sign and making my way up to the ruins of that old town in the dead of night. So, without so much as a second thought to my own well-being, I returned to Ambivalence Grove. I'll admit, in the scarce lighting, the woods appeared a bit creepier and ominous, but the forest was just as alive as it was during daylight hours. Of course, it didn't help that I had to wait until I was sure my parents were sound asleep, making it nearly 1 a.m. by the time I arrived. The roads were as silent as the woods themselves. It was a little difficult to follow the trail in the black, especially without the assistance of a full moon, but I was making good use out of the incredible flashlight app on my phone. I pretty much figured I'd see him, or at least catch wind of something off. But for the most part, I only experienced disappointment. The decrepit old town of Ambivalence was nothing more than a pile of ruin, concealed by the woodland itself. The still erected church stood high, but was still only a shell of its former self. I called out to him. I yelled into the forest for him to face me, to show himself, or itself. Nothing. I waited with anxiety, even shedding a few tears as the result of my perceived defeat. I knew that if I did not head home soon, that my mom and dad would awake before me, and getting out of the house after that would be nothing short of impossible. I let out a deep sigh and hung my head low as I began to walk away and head back towards the road. I wasn't sure at first, so I halted my movements. Looking back, I likely could have cut the tension with a knife, as cliché as that may sound, but the more I listened, still and silent, the more I became aware of a very faint whisper of a noise, dancing in the air in an almost impossible way, like it wasn't there, yet it was at the same time. Like an incorporeal sound. Crying. I heard the almost non-existent sounds of agony, and the more attuned I became to them, the more I realized what a cacophony it was. Like a vast, unseen ocean of sorrow and pain. I was unsettled, yes, but I also felt invigoration welling up inside me. It was all real. I wasn't crazy. I knew at this moment that Steph and I would somehow be reunited, and I was now sure-footed in exactly what it was that I needed to do, reinforced by the message I discovered the following morning, the black swirls I noticed in the front yard earlier that night. The Shadow Man, Mr. Midnight, had left me a message, and I was happy to acquiesce to his intentions. The light of the sun revealed the marks to scribe out a message in the burned remains of grass. Something my parents still believe was simple teenage vandalism. The iconic phrase, "See you soon," was etched clear as day, and he was damn right. We would most definitely meet as soon as that thing decided to face me, and this time I would be ready. How long? 2 months. I was forced to wait until the light of the blue moon. I had gone back to Ambivalence a few times since that night, but never found anything more. Mostly a lot less, or just more of the same. It was as if there was a thin barrier between that place and some place beyond it, like something pushing on a thin piece of plastic, not pervading enough to see it, but able to tell that there's something behind it. I imagined this place, this old ghost town, served as some sort of portal, and the light of the moon as its key. But as a result, I knew there was no guarantee of my return. But I didn't care. I cared only for finding Steph, This was all my idea, from the start. Her involvement was my fault, and now she suffered because of it. I would have asked a few friends for help, to accompany me, but A, I didn't want to end up responsible for their fate as well, and B, they likely would have decided me mad, maybe even refocusing the police investigation on me. So, fully prepared and having an alibi ready beforehand, I achieved my goal of making it out to that old sign in the dead of night one last time. The night of the blue moon had descended, and I stood by that sign waiting all alone for the Midnight Man. Or so I thought. I waited anxiously next to that old sign, reading its words in my head over and over again. See you soon. See you soon. Yeah, I'm coming, Steph. I will see you soon. I promise, I thought to myself. I looked down at my watch. 11:57. I looked up and saw nothing but the silent and sporadically glowing forest. No sign of him. 11:58. Still nothing. I looked down once again at 11:59 and midnight. At 11:59 there was no one. I peered into the woods, anxiously awaiting the arrival of midnight without scanning my watch, waiting to see him appear. It felt like an hour had passed, and I had to look. Midnight. And just like that, seemingly out of thin air, I looked up, and there he was. I had only shifted my gaze for a fraction of a second, but in that very small passage of time, he was simply there, about 15 feet from me. He appeared no differently from the last I had caught sight of him, adorned in the blackest of blacks, from foot to hat, standing silently, waiting for me to make a move. I took a step, and he turned away from me. I trailed behind him at a steady pace, a steady distance from him, leading me up the hill through the blackened forest, towards the heart of the locally infamous deserted town of Ambivalence Grove. I never once caught notice of my secret watcher, far too distant for me to catch sight of him, but his binoculars never once lost sight of me. Detective Williamson apparently never lost interest in my involvement regarding Stephanie's disappearance, and he just so happened to decide to watch my home on that particular night, following my parents as they dropped me off at Dave's once more, and then doing the same once I left his house in the dead of night. It was when he saw the form that I had followed that he hesitated in his resolve, but only for a moment, assuring himself that the shadowy mass must be some accomplice of mine, not visible due to the casting of shadows. He was convinced that I was involved in some sort of twisted teenage homicide deviance, and the sight of the Midnight Man only wavered his tenacity for a moment. And yet, as I walked, he did not follow. He was certain that I would eventually return. I wasn't as optimistic. As we reached the top of the wooded hill, the Midnight Man disappeared over the crest. I was close behind him, so I assumed that once I did the same, I would easily regain my sight of him. But in contrast, when I peered up over the ridge, I rested vision on something else, something more astonishingly awkward and out of place than Mr. Midnight himself. Ambivalence. The town of Ambivalence seemed to be erected in all of its former respective glory. The foundations, once covered by moss, leaves, and growing trees, now stood bizarre amongst the lush forest life that still gathered in what I deemed to be old streets. Every single home in the small town, even those I had yet to discover through the remnants of foundations and rubble, the church was easily seen from a relatively large distance in the dark, was now recognizably different, almost newer. Peeled and worn away paint had now been restored. I had to snap myself out of my bewilderment. I was sure that Stephanie was here someplace, and I had to find her. She was counting on me to find her. I ran into the first house I saw, easily accessible through the tall grass and infrequent thistles. The lights were off inside, the windows dark, but each and every home was perceived as the same, consistent in its seemingly unoccupants. When I practically burst in through the old creaky door, it was the odor that I detected first. More foul than anything I'd ever experienced up to that point in my life. Sour, rancid, like socks and old milk spread over festering meat and then spritzed with a pungent blue cheese. I gagged. I nearly vomited right there where I stood, but I swallowed it down and forced myself to press forward. A long, low, bellowing sound murmured from the next room over, through a rickety, old-fashioned archway. I shined my cell light in as I turned the corner, and when I first saw it, I couldn't distinguish what it was. The image was so foreign, my mind struggled to regain equilibrium, the force that drove me onward and towards the pale heap with what appeared to be black splotches and blots. I heard a wet slap, and my right foot collided with the floor about halfway through the room. When I looked down, I saw it was something dark and wet, and upon further examination, I found what I feared to be true. It was blood. A pool of blood that trailed off towards the other side of the room, leading to the heap. I squinted and probed the image with my eyes. About 30 seconds passed before the breath was seemingly ripped from my chest, and I nearly dropped my phone, which would have landed me in darkness. I gripped the phone tighter and covered my mouth with my other hand, trying so hard not to throw up. I couldn't identify it at first, because it was so bloated, deep within the stages of decomposition. It was a corpse. What looked to be like a large, fat, bald man lay in a pile in the corner, although I assume that the man was once much thinner. His mouth was stretched wide open, far past what a typical jaw is capable of. His lips appeared to have been rotted away, leaving a rim of blackened, necrotic flesh encircling the circumference of the orifice. His eyes were nothing but festering, dark, oozing pits, and his skin was so leathery and a faded shade of gray, it nearly matched his faded and blood-stained clothing, making him appear naked at first. A dripping, dark slime, what I assume was mostly decaying remains of blood, still somehow flowed and dripped and ran from his physicality, causing the bloody dark slime pool on the floor in which I stepped. My attempts proved futile as I vomited on the floor before me, and amongst my retching and stifled attempts at breathing, I heard it. Him. I looked up and that thing was moving, groaning. I turned, screamed, tore ass for the door, only making out one word that left the man's whispering lack of lips. Church. Why would I listen to the decaying corpse on the floor, you ask? Well, under the circumstances, I could give you quite a few reasons, but none of that would change the fact that I entered this damn church anyway. At first, slamming my way through the large set of relatively new double doors, I felt nothing but relief, joy. Stephanie was there, sitting by the front podium beyond the sea of pews. She was sobbing, but she stopped instantly when she heard the sound of my clattering entrance. With a sniffle and slight hesitation so as to make out what approached her in the darkness, she finally let the words pass from her lips.
I knew you'd find me. Oh God, please tell me it's really you.
It's me, I reassured her, moving in to embrace her in my arms.
Oh God, I thought, please just take me home.
Steph wept as she spoke to me. It's okay. I'm gonna get you out of here. I noticed Steph's eyes grow wide in fear, and then sorrow returned to her face.
Oh no, not again,
she said in a sad whisper. When I turned, my heart sank into my bowels. My fears had been realized. I took a breath and comforted myself via remembrance of my previous resolution. I was okay with it. The door was gone. There was no way out. We even tried for hours. Hours turned into days. Days into weeks. Weeks into months. And yet we linger here. No food to satisfy hunger, no water to quench thirst. Yet we do not die. And whether this is hell that we're trapped in or not, it doesn't matter. I got what I wanted. I had found Stephanie, and at least we would have each other, together forever.
Well, that just goes to show you, with hard work and determination, you may just get what you wish for. Eternally yours. Of course, there is yet more of this terror tale to tell, but we'll save that for another time. But if I've created an itch that you just can't scratch, make sure to drop in again next weekend. And until then, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you all again next Saturday.